The first thing I noticed wasn't the noise, it was the silence after it stopped. I stepped out onto my back porch barefoot, the wood still cool from the morning shade, and that's when the smell hit me, fresh sap, sharp and raw, like something living had just been cut open. My eyes followed the line where my trees used to stand, a wall of green that had framed this land for as long as I could remember, and now it was gone. 30 years of growth, wiped clean in a single morning. All that remained were jagged stumps, pale and exposed, stretching across the property line like broken teeth. And beyond them, I could see it. Wide open sky where there had never been sky before, a perfect, unobstructed view straight into the back patios of two neighboring HOA developments. That's when I understood. This wasn't random. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and this land, 42 acres just outside Travis County, has been in my family since 1987. My dad planted those trees himself. I remember holding the shovel at 8 years old, dirt under my fingernails, while he lined them up one by one along the ridge. He used to say trees weren't just for shade. They were boundaries you could feel, privacy you could grow. And now, standing there with the morning air too quiet and the horizon too wide, I realized someone had decided those boundaries didn't matter anymore. I walked closer, boots crunching over bark and sawdust, and that's when I saw the tire tracks. Heavy equipment, multiple passes, cutting deep into soil that wasn't theirs to touch. A yellow survey flag had been knocked over, half buried in the dirt like it had been stepped on and forgotten. I picked it up, brushed it off, and followed the line. 12 feet. That's how far they'd crossed into my property. 12 feet too far. My jaw tightened as I looked up again, this time focusing past the damage. Two neighborhoods sat on the rise beyond my land. Willow Crest Estates to the left, Brookhaven Ridge to the right. Matching stone entryways, identical manicured lawns, and the kind of people who talked about views like they were something you could own. I'd seen their listings before. Panoramic hill country scenery. Unobstructed sunset exposure. Words that sold houses for $500,000 more. And now, thanks to what they'd done, those words were finally true. For them. I pulled my phone out slowly, hands steady, and started recording. The stumps. The tracks. The broken markers. Every detail. I didn't say a word. Didn't call anyone. Not yet. Because somewhere between the silence of those missing trees and the perfect view they'd just carved out for themselves, I realized something else. They thought this was over. They thought they'd already won. What they didn't know was that they'd just stepped onto my land, crossed my line, and handed me something far more valuable than trees. Evidence. I did not call the police that morning, and I did not walk over to either of those neighborhoods demanding answers. Because I have learned something about people who think they can take what is not theirs. They always leave a paper trail, even when they believe they are being careful. Instead, I went inside, wiped the sawdust off my hands, and pulled out the old metal filing cabinet in my office, the one that still smelled faintly like engine oil and cedar. The drawer stuck halfway like it always did, and when it finally gave, the sound echoed through the room sharper than it should have. Inside were decades of documents, survey maps, tax records, easement agreements, everything my father had kept in perfect order, labeled in his block handwriting. I spread them across the desk, each page carrying a piece of the boundary they had just ignored. The original survey from 1987 was still there, stamped and signed, showing every inch of the property line down to the foot. I traced it slowly with my finger, following the ridge where those trees had stood, and there it was, clear as day. The line did not bend. It did not blur. It did not give permission. I pulled up the county records next, the online database loading slow like it always does when you actually need it, and cross-checked everything. Parcel numbers, coordinates, recorded plats. Every source told the same story. That land was mine. Not shared. Not disputed. Mine. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen, the faint hum of the computer filling the silence that the chainsaws had left behind, and then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten just a little. Recent filings. 2 of them. Both tied to the neighboring developments. Both approved within the last 6 months. I opened the first document and felt the corner of my mouth lift in a way that had nothing to do with humor. It was a marketing packet. Detailed. Polished. Full of phrases about enhanced sightlines and expanded scenic exposure. They had not just cut the trees. They had planned for it. The second document was even better. A development update filed with the county, signed by representatives from both HOAs, outlining view optimization improvements along the shared boundary. Shared. That word sat there on the page like it belonged, like it had always been true. But it was not. And the moment they wrote it down, the moment they submitted it as fact, they crossed from arrogance into something else entirely. I printed everything, each page sliding out with a mechanical certainty that matched the feeling settling in my chest. I stacked the papers neatly, squared the edges, and clipped them together. No raised voices. No confrontation. Just evidence building, piece by piece. Then I walked back outside, the sunlight hitting that empty stretch of land where the trees used to stand, and I looked straight through the gap they had created. I could see patio furniture, glass railings, freshly staged backyards waiting for buyers who would pay extra for a view that did not belong to them. And standing there, with the wind moving freely where it never used to reach, I realized something they had not considered. They had made their profit depend on my loss. They had tied their property value to something they did not own. And in doing that, they had given me exactly what I needed to take it all back. I waited exactly 3 days before I made my first move, not because I needed time to think, but because I needed them to keep moving, to keep building their story on top of the lie they had already committed to. Every morning, I walked the same line along my property, boots pressing into the soft dirt where roots used to hold the ground together, and I watched. Contractors came and went. Real estate agents in pressed shirts and polished shoes walked clients along those back patios, pointing out across what used to be my tree line like they were unveiling something they had earned. I stayed quiet, phone in my pocket, recording everything without drawing attention. Conversations carried farther now without the trees, and I caught phrases drifting on the air. You will never lose this view. Protected sightline. Nothing can be built here. That last one almost made me smile. Nothing can be built here. They were right about one thing. They just had no idea why. By the fourth day, I had enough. Not anger. Not frustration. Enough evidence. I drove into town just after 9, the sun already heating the pavement, and parked outside a low brick office that most people would never notice unless they needed it. Land use litigation. Property damage. Timber trespass. The kind of law that does not raise its voice, but still wins. The receptionist looked up as I walked in, the faint smell of coffee and printer ink filling the room, and within 20 minutes I was sitting across from a man named Daniel Reeves, a specialist in cases most people do not realize exist until it is too late. I laid the documents out in front of him one by one. Survey maps, county filings, marketing materials, video stills from my phone showing the exact moment those trees came down. He did not interrupt. He did not react. He just watched, flipping pages slowly, occasionally nodding like he was confirming something he already suspected. When he finally leaned back, he folded his hands and gave a small, almost satisfied exhale. They did not just cross your property line, he said, voice calm and measured. They built their entire valuation strategy on top of it. I did not say anything. I just let that sit in the air. He tapped the stack of papers lightly. In Texas, cutting trees on someone else's land is not just damage. It is called timber trespass. And when it is done knowingly, the penalties multiply. He paused, then added, especially when it affects property value on this scale. I could feel it then, not excitement, not revenge, but something steadier. Direction. He began outlining the approach, each step precise. We would not rush. We would not warn them. We would let their listings go live. Let their sales close. Let buyers sign contracts based on promises that were never theirs to make. Then we would file, not just for the trees, but for the misrepresentation, the boundary violation, the financial gain built on unauthorized land use. Every word he used landed with weight, like pieces locking into place. By the time I left his office, the sun was high and the air felt different, like the day had shifted without anyone noticing. I drove back to the property, parked in the same spot, and stepped out into that open stretch again. The wind moved freely, just like before, carrying the distant sound of someone laughing on a patio that should not have had that view in the first place. I looked down at the ground where the stumps still stood, rough and uneven, and then back up at the houses beyond. They thought they had cleared the problem. What they actually did was clear the path. I did exactly what Daniel told me to do. which meant doing nothing at all on the surface while everything underneath started to move, slow and precise like pressure building behind a locked gate. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched those listings go live one by one, glossy photos uploaded to every real estate site that mattered, each one framed perfectly to capture the gap where my trees used to stand. Wide-angle shots, golden hour lighting, captions that practically sold the sky itself, expansive hill country views, permanent open sight line, backs to protected green space. That last phrase showed up 3 different times, word for word, like someone had decided it sounded official enough to be true. I saved every listing. Screenshots, timestamps, archived pages. Nothing complicated, just clean documentation stacking up piece by piece. The air stayed warm that week, the kind of dry Texas heat that carries sound farther than it should, and from my side of the line, I could hear open house chatter drifting over the new empty stretch. Car doors closing. Heels on stone patios. Agents talking just loud enough to sound confident. No risk of obstruction. This view is here to stay. I stood there more than once, hands in my pockets, listening without being seen, letting them build their certainty on top of something that did not belong to them. By the end of the month, 3 homes had gone under contract. One had already closed. Papers signed. Money transferred. New owners walking out onto those back patios for the first time, looking out across land they believed was permanently open. That was when Daniel called. His voice came through calm, same as before, like he was reading from a script that never changed. "We are ready," he said. No urgency, no drama, just timing. I drove into his office again that afternoon, the sky flat and bright overhead, and this time the stack of documents on his desk was thicker than the one I had brought in. He had added to it formal surveys, certified appraisals calculating the loss of tree value down to species, age, and replacement cost. Legal precedents highlighted in clean yellow lines. He slid one page across to me, a demand letter drafted in language so precise it felt like it had edges. It outlined everything. Unauthorized entry, timber trespass, boundary violation, financial gain derived from misrepresentation. Each point backed by evidence we had already secured. There was no emotion in it. No accusation beyond what could be proven. Just facts arranged in a way that left very little room to move. "We send this to both associations and their developers," Daniel said, tapping the header lightly. "We give them a chance to respond. They will not respond correctly." I looked at the page, then back at him. "And when they do not?" He gave a small nod, like he had already seen the next step play out 100 times. "Then we file." I left the office with a copy in my hand, the paper heavier than it should have been, and drove back out to the property as the sun started to dip lower, casting long shadows across the open ground. The stumps were still there, silent and rough, but the space felt different now. Not empty. Waiting. I walked the line again, stopping right where the first tree used to stand, and looked out toward those houses, their glass windows catching the light like nothing had ever been wrong. Somewhere behind those walls, people were settling into homes they believed came with a view that could not be taken away. I folded the letter once, slid it back into the envelope, and let my eyes rest on the horizon they had fought so hard to create. They thought the view was permanent. What they did not understand was that it had already started to expire. The letters went out on a Tuesday morning, certified, tracked, and signed for by noon, and I knew the exact moment they were opened because my phone started buzzing before I even finished my second cup of coffee. The first call came from a number I did not recognize, polished voice, controlled tone, the kind of person who is used to managing problems before they become real. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Linda Harper, president of Willow Crest Estates," she said, like the title itself was supposed to carry weight. I stepped outside while she spoke, the gravel crunching under my boots as I walked toward the line where the trees used to stand, letting her words fill the same open space her decisions had created. She called it a misunderstanding, a boundary ambiguity, claimed their contractors had acted under the assumption of shared access. The phrases came fast, carefully chosen, like she had rehearsed them in front of a mirror. I did not interrupt. I just let her talk until the silence on my end made her uncomfortable enough to stop. The survey markers were intact. I said finally, voice even. "You crossed them anyway." There was a pause, short but noticeable, and when she spoke again the tone shifted just slightly, less confident, more defensive. We believe this can be resolved without escalating to litigation. I looked out across the cleared stretch, the afternoon light hitting those back patios exactly the way they had advertised, and I could hear a lawn sprinkler clicking on somewhere in the distance, steady and rhythmic. You already escalated it, I said. Then I hung up. The second call came an hour later. Greg Whitmore from Brookhaven Ridge. Different voice, same strategy. He leaned harder into the idea that the land was not being used, that the improvements had increased overall community value, like that somehow balanced the equation. I could almost picture him standing in a glass office, one hand on a desk, looking out at the same view they had created, convinced that numbers would protect him. We are prepared to offer compensation for the trees, he said, and that was the moment I knew they still did not understand what they had done. I let a few seconds pass before answering. This is not about trees anymore, I said. The line went quiet on his end, and for the first time since all of this started, I could hear uncertainty creeping in. By the end of the day, both associations had responded formally through their attorneys. Denials, deflections, attempts to reframe the situation as cooperative development rather than trespass. Daniel read through everything with the same calm focus he always had, marking sections, making notes, occasionally shaking his head like he was watching someone walk straight into a wall they could not see. They are doing exactly what we expected, he said, setting the papers down. They are doubling down. I sat across from him, the hum of the office lights steady overhead, and felt that same sense of direction settle in again, stronger this time. Good, I said. He gave a small nod. Good for us. The filing happened 2 days later. No announcement. No warning. Just a case number entered into the system and a stack of evidence that spoke for itself. When the notices were served, the tone changed almost immediately. Emails replaced phone calls. Longer messages. More urgent language. Words like exposure and liability started appearing where there had been confidence before. Out on my land, nothing looked different. The stumps were still there. The view was still wide open. People still walked those patios in the evenings, drinks in hand, watching the sunset like it belonged to them. But something had shifted underneath all of it, something they could not see from where they were standing. They thought this was a negotiation. They thought it was about finding a number that would make me go away. Standing there at the edge of my property, looking out at the space they had cleared, I realized the truth had already moved past that point. This was no longer something they could settle quietly. This was something that was going to follow them all the way to the end. The first court date did not feel dramatic the way people imagine it. There were no raised voices or sudden revelations, just a quiet room, the low hum of air conditioning, and the steady rhythm of paperwork moving from one side of the table to the other. But beneath that calm surface, everything was shifting. I sat beside Daniel, hands folded, watching as their legal team laid out their defense, and it sounded exactly like what they had been saying from the beginning, dressed up in more formal language but built on the same fragile assumptions. They argued ambiguity, claimed the boundary had been unclear, suggested the tree removal had been an improvement that benefited all surrounding properties, and every time they said it, I could feel how thin it was, like something stretched too far past its limit. Daniel did not interrupt them. He just waited, letting them finish, letting the record capture every word, because once something is said in that room, it does not disappear. When it was our turn, he stood slowly, adjusted a single page on the table, and began walking through the evidence piece by piece. No rush, no emotion, just clarity. The original survey, the flag boundary markers, the recorded footage, the marketing materials that promised a view they did not own. Each item placed exactly where it needed to be, like he was building something they could not take apart. I watched their expressions change as he spoke, small shifts at first, a glance between attorneys, a pause before responding, the kind of reactions you only notice when you are looking for them. Then came the part that mattered. The valuation report. Daniel slid it forward, referencing the certified appraisal that calculated not just the cost of the trees, but the impact their removal had on the surrounding property values, including the premium those developments were now charging for the view they had created. It was not just damage. It was profit built on damage. That distinction landed harder than anything else. You could see it in the way the room went quieter, like everyone understood at the same time that this was no longer a simple dispute over land. This was about gain, about intent, about a decision that had been made with the expectation that no one would push back. The judge asked a few questions, precise and controlled, focusing on timelines, permits, and whether any formal agreement had ever existed between my property and either association. The answers from their side came slower now, less certain, and each one seemed to narrow the space they had left to stand on. When the session ended, there was no ruling yet, just the next date set. The process continuing the way it always does, measured and deliberate. But as we stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Their attorneys were no longer speaking in confident tones. Conversations were shorter, more guarded, like they were recalculating something they had underestimated. Daniel glanced at me, a small nod, nothing more, but it was enough. I walked outside into the late afternoon light, the sun hanging low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. And for the first time since this started, I could feel the shift not just in documents or arguments, but in direction. Back on my land that evening, I stood at the edge of that open stretch again, the wind moving freely through a space that used to be protected, and I looked out toward those houses where lights were starting to come on one by one. From a distance, everything still looked perfect. Clean lines, open views, calm, quiet neighborhoods settling into the night. But I knew something they did not. That view they were enjoying, the one they had built their confidence on, was now sitting in the middle of a case that was no longer under their control. And once something enters that system, it does not move on their timeline anymore. It moves on its own. By the time the second hearing came around, the tone had changed completely, not just in the courtroom, but everywhere this case touched. And you could feel it in the way people moved, the way they spoke, the way they avoided saying certain things out loud. I noticed it first in the listings. Quiet edits, subtle changes. Phrases like permanent view disappeared overnight, replaced with softer language. Open sightline subject to surrounding development. It was careful, almost invisible unless you had the original version saved the way I did, but it told me everything I needed to know. They were adjusting, not admitting fault, not yet, but preparing for the possibility that their certainty might not hold. In court, their strategy shifted too. Less about denial, more about minimizing. Their attorneys leaned into the idea that any financial gain had been incidental, that the view had only marginally influenced property value, that the tree removal, while unfortunate, had not materially altered the market. It sounded reasonable on the surface, which is exactly why they chose it. But Daniel was already ahead of that argument. When he stood this time, he did not start with the trees or the boundary or even the footage. He started with the buyers. Real contracts. Real numbers. He walked through 3 completed sales, line by line, highlighting the price differences between comparable homes with and without that newly created view. The gap was not small. It was measurable, consistent, and tied directly to the marketing language they had already put into the record. Then he introduced something new. Depositions. Statements from the buyers themselves, taken under oath, describing exactly what influenced their decision. The view was a deciding factor. We were told it would remain unobstructed. Hearing those words spoken in that room carried a different weight than reading them on paper. They were no longer just claims. They were commitments that had been made and relied upon. I watched the opposing counsel shift in their seats, papers moving a little faster now, whispers exchanged in lower tones, and for the first time, there was no attempt to interrupt. No pushback, just listening. The judge asked fewer questions this time, but each one cut deeper, focusing on whether those representations could have been made without verifying ownership of the land that created the view in the first place. There was no clean answer to that. When the session ended, it was shorter than the first, but it left more behind. Outside, the air felt heavier, like something had settled into place that was not going to move again. Their attorneys did not approach us this time. No casual conversations. No attempts at framing the situation. They left quickly, folders held tight, conversations already turning inward. Back on my property later that evening, I stood in the same spot I had been returning to since the beginning, right where the first tree used to stand, and I looked out across the open stretch again. The view was still there, clear, wide, exactly the way they had wanted it. But now it felt different, not because of what had changed physically, but because of what had changed around it. That view was no longer an advantage. It was evidence. Every sunset they sold, every dollar tied to that open space, Every promise made about what could or could not be built there, all of it was now part of something bigger than they could control. The wind moved through the empty line again, steady and constant, and I could hear voices in the distance, neighbors talking, someone laughing, the normal sounds of a place that had not yet realized it was about to change. I let my gaze settle on the houses one last time before turning back toward my own land, and as I walked away, there was a clarity in that moment that had not been there before. They had spent all this time trying to protect a view they thought gave them power. What they never understood was that the moment they took it, it stopped being theirs. The final hearing did not start with tension, it started with quiet, the kind that settles into a room when everyone already understands what is about to happen, even if no one says it out loud. I sat in the same seat, the same polished wood table in front of me, the same steady hum of air conditioning overhead, but nothing felt the same anymore. Across the room, their side looked different too. Fewer people, tighter posture, no extra movement. The confidence that had been there at the beginning had thinned into something more careful, something measured. Daniel did not rush when the proceedings began. He did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been placed into the record piece by piece over the past weeks. This was not about introducing new facts. This was about letting the structure hold. When he stood, he spoke simply, walking back through the core points without adding weight where it was not needed. Unauthorized entry, verified boundary, intentional removal, documented financial gain tied directly to that removal. Each phrase landed clean, supported by evidence that had already been examined, already been challenged, already been left standing. There was no urgency in his voice because there was no gap left to fill. When their attorney responded, it was shorter than before, focused on limiting the scope, attempting to frame the situation as an overreach in damages rather than a denial of what had happened. It was the last position available to them, and everyone in the room seemed to recognize it for what it was. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making a note, occasionally looking up with the same steady expression that had not changed since the first hearing. Then came the pause. Not long, just enough for the room to settle into stillness. When the ruling was delivered, it was done without emphasis, without drama, just clear language placed exactly where it needed to be. Liability established. Trespass confirmed. Damages awarded. The number itself was read once, precise and final, and it carried more weight in that quiet room than any raised voice ever could. But it did not stop there. The ruling addressed the financial benefit derived from the misrepresentation, tying the outcome not just to the loss of the trees, but to the gain that had followed. Enforcement mechanisms were outlined, structured in a way that ensured compliance whether they agreed with it or not. I did not react immediately. I did not look over at them. I just sat there, letting the words settle, the same way I had let everything else settle since the beginning. When it was over, chairs moved, papers gathered, conversations resumed in low tones, but none of it reached me the same way it would have before. Outside, the light was softer, late afternoon stretching toward evening, and the air felt different again, not heavier this time, just resolved. Daniel stepped beside me, gave a small nod, and that was enough. No celebration, no extra words, just confirmation. I drove back out to the property as the sun started to drop, casting long shadows across the land that had carried this entire case from the first cut to this moment. The stumps were still there, unchanged, but everything around them had shifted. I walked the line one more time, stopping at the same place, looking out across the open view that had started all of this. The houses were still there. The patios, the glass, the same stretch of sky. But now there was something else layered over it, something you could not see unless you knew where to look. That view was no longer just open space. It was attached to a judgment, to a number, to a decision that had already been made. And standing there, with the wind moving through that empty line again, I understood something simple and final. They had taken the trees thinking they were clearing their view. What they actually did was sign it over. The paperwork did not take long after the ruling, not the way people expect, because once a decision like that is entered, the system does not hesitate. It moves forward with a kind of quiet certainty that does not need to announce itself. Within weeks, the numbers that had been read in that courtroom started turning into actions, liens attaching to properties, obligations converting into something enforceable, something real. I did not have to chase it. I did not have to argue. The process handled that part on its own. I just watched it unfold the same way I had watched everything else, steady, patient, letting each step land exactly where it was supposed to. One afternoon, a new set of documents arrived, thicker than anything before, stamped, recorded, finalized. I set them down on the same desk where my father used to keep his surveys, the same surface where this entire situation had started to take shape, and I read through them. Slowly, line by line. Parcel descriptions, legal transfers, boundaries shifting not through force, not through negotiation, but through consequence. By the time I reached the last page, the outcome was no longer theoretical. It was written, filed, and recognized. The land that had once been used to frame their view now belonged to me. I drove out there that evening, the sky stretching wide the way it always had. Only now there was nothing left to question about where anything began or ended. The entrance to one of the developments had a small sign near the back edge, something decorative, something meant to mark a transition that no longer held the same meaning. I parked just outside it and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots in a way that felt familiar again, like something had settled back into place. The air was still, carrying the faint smell of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. Normal sounds, normal smells, but layered over something different now. Ownership. I walked the new line slowly, following the survey markers that had been ignored before and were now impossible to dismiss. 12 feet did not seem like much when they crossed it. Standing there now, it felt like everything. Beyond that line, the same patios stretched out, the same glass railings catching the last light of the day, but the perspective had shifted. What they looked out at was no longer something they could define. It was something they had lost control over the moment they decided it did not matter. I stopped where the ground dipped slightly, right where the largest tree used to stand, and let my eyes move across the open space one more time. The view was still there, clear and wide, untouched by anything new. I could have left it that way. I could have let them keep believing it would stay exactly as it was. But that was never the point. The point was never to take something from them the way they had taken from me. The point was to restore what had been ignored, to draw the line back where it belonged. Over the next few weeks, new markers went in, clean and visible, followed by the first signs of change. Not immediate, not aggressive, just deliberate. Plans filed. Permits approved. The kind of steps that take time, but do not stop once they begin. I stood there one last time as the sun dropped below the horizon, the light fading evenly across land that now carried a different story than it had before. The space where those trees once stood would not stay empty forever. It would grow again, in a way that respected the line that had been there all along. And somewhere behind me, in houses built on a view they thought would never change, people were starting to realize something they had not considered when they first stepped onto those patios. A view is not something you own just because you can see it. And when you build your certainty on something that was never yours, it does not disappear all at once. It fades, piece by piece, until the truth stands in its place. I turned back toward my land, the ground solid under my feet, and kept walking without looking back, because there was nothing left to prove. The line had already been drawn, and this time, it was not going anywhere.